The drive to nowhere. The Whitaker family had been searching for the perfect getaway for months. With the past year's chaos weighing heavily on their shoulders, Ben and Lisa Whitaker were determined to give their kids, Ella and Max, a summer vacation that none of them would forget. Ben's Keo worker had mentioned a secluded cabin up north, nestled deep in the woods, far from the noise and demands of the city. The journey took longer than expected. Ben's GPS was spotty as they climbed deeper into the dense forest. Tall, ancient trees loomed over the winding roads, branches knotted together in an impenetrable canopy that blocked out most of the light. It made the day seem much later than it actually was. The kids were growing restless in the back seat. 12-year-old Ella was glued to her phone, trying to capture any fleeting cell service. Her younger brother Max, an avid nature lover, was glued to the window, wide-eyed at every passing animal and every rustle in the bushes. After what felt like an eternity, they finally arrived. The cabin was perched at the edge of a small clearing surrounded by trees so thick it was as though they'd stepped into a different world. It was humble and worn but sturdy, and its tall, shadowy shape against the trees seemed like it had been part of the forest forever. "It's a little creepy," Ella muttered as they piled out of the car, glancing toward the woods that circled them, dark and dense. Shadows danced between the trees, giving off a sensation of being watched, as though something lurked just beyond their sight. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," Ben laughed. "It's just the woods. It's peaceful, isn't it?" Max, his eyes still wide, was the first to dash towards the trees. "Can I go exploring?" he asked, his voice full of excitement. "No, Max, not yet," Lisa said, hauling their bags from the car. "Let's settle in first. And no wandering off alone, okay?" Reluctantly, Max stepped back from the tree line, glancing over his shoulder into the dark forest, as if something was calling to him. He thought he saw a flash of movement, a figure or maybe an animal, but when he looked harder, nothing was there. Inside the cabin, the air was stale and cold. The family spent an hour sweeping out dust, unpacking, and rearranging the few amenities to make the place feel more like home. Ben lit a fire in the old stone fireplace, and soon a cozy warmth spread through the cabin. That night, after they'd finished a simple meal and the kids had settled into their room, Ben and Lisa sat by the fireplace, sharing a glass of wine. The forest was quiet outside, but they could hear the occasional creak and groan of the cabin settling. The darkness outside the windows seemed to press against the glass, as though it wanted in. "Did you hear about the legend around here?" Ben asked with a mischievous glint in his eye. "The Wendigo?" Lisa rolled her eyes. "Seriously, Ben?" He chuckled. "What?" "It's part of the local folklore. People say there's this creature that roams these woods, feeding on lost hikers. Some call it the Wendigo, a tall, skeletal figure with antlers, moving silently through the trees." Lisa shook her head, but Ben could see a flicker of unease in her eyes. "You're going to scare the kids if you keep talking like that. They won't know," he said, grinning. But as he looked at the cabin's door, secure yet fragile against the vast forest beyond, even Ben couldn't shake the feeling of something watching them. It was as if the forest had eyes, and they were waiting for something to happen. That night, while everyone slept, the forest grew even quieter, as though it were holding its breath. The wind stirred just enough to rustle the leaves and tap at the cabin's windows, a gentle yet persistent sound that seemed like a soft whisper. And in the darkness, hidden among the trees, something watched the cabin, its gaze locked on the family inside. It waited, patient, hungry. Morning came with a gray light filtering through the trees, casting a pale glow over the clearing. Lisa was the first to wake, shivering slightly despite the fireplace's embers still faintly glowing in the cabin's hearth. She moved to the window, stretching and rubbing her arms, and found herself gazing out at the forest. She could have sworn she saw movement, shadows slipping through the trees. But after a moment, she dismissed it as her mind playing tricks on her. The isolation and quiet made her imagination run wild. The kids soon shuffled out of their room, still groggy from the long drive and a restless night. "Mom, is there really no Wi-Fi?" Ella groaned, clutching her phone in despair. Lisa laughed softly. "No Wi-Fi, no cell service, welcome to the wilderness. While Ella sulked, Max's face lit up. Can I go out and explore now? Only if you take Ella with you, Ben chimed in, stifling a yawn. We don't want you wandering off alone. He looked at Ella with a sympathetic smile. Come on, give it a try, Ella. It's only for a week. After some reluctant complaining, Ella agreed. She and Max grabbed their jackets and headed out, stepping cautiously into the thick morning fog that clung to the trees like a silvery cloak. As soon as they reached the edge of the clearing, Max's curiosity kicked into high gear. He darted from tree to tree, examining moss, animal tracks, and wild mushrooms with fascination. Ella trailed behind, snapping a few pictures with her phone when the scenery caught her eye, though she couldn't help feeling uneasy. The quiet in the woods was heavy, almost oppressive, with only the occasional caw of a crow cutting through it. Suddenly, a faint snap of a twig broke the silence, freezing both kids in their tracks. Ella turned, scanning the trees for anything unusual. Max, did you hear that? Probably just a squirrel, Max said confidently, but even he sounded unsure. They stood still for a few moments, listening, but there was nothing, just the sound of their own breathing. They were about to continue when Ella spotted something strange on a nearby tree, long, deep scratches carved into the bark. They were spaced wide apart, far too wide to be the mark of any small animal. Max, look at this, she whispered, feeling a prickle of fear. Max's eyes widened as he examined the scratches, tracing one of them with his fingers. It's probably a bear, right? Bears don't live around here, Ella said, trying to keep her voice steady. Besides, these look old. Maybe it was someone with a knife or something, or some kind of joke. But she didn't believe her own words. The marks seemed too raw, too recent, and there was something unsettling about their jagged, uneven shape. After a few moments, Max tugged at her arm. Let's go back. I don't like it here. Ella nodded, grateful to leave the eerie tree behind. As they turned back towards the cabin, she felt a sensation she couldn't shake. A prickling at the back of her neck, like eyes boring into her from the shadows. Unbeknownst to them, a figure watched from deep within the forest. It moved slowly, gliding from one tree to the next, its steps eerily silent. Its eyes, hollow and hungry, locked onto the two children as they disappeared into the fog. Back at the cabin, the kids burst in, their faces pale and serious. Did you have fun? Ben asked, setting a fresh pot of coffee on the table. There's something weird out there, Dad, Ella said, her voice quiet but certain. Yeah, we saw these giant claw marks, Max added, his enthusiasm replaced by a hint of fear. Something big must have made them. Ben's brows furrowed as he shared a quick look with Lisa. Oh, come on. It was probably an old mark left by some animal ages ago, he said, trying to keep his voice light. But Ella and Max both shook their heads. No, Dad, it was fresh, Ella insisted, like something was watching us. Ben forced a chuckle, though he could sense the tension in the room. I'll check it out later, okay? But I'm sure it's nothing. He ruffled Max's hair. You two don't need to worry, but as the day wore on, an unsettling feeling crept over the family. A constant awareness of the silent forest beyond their windows, the feeling of being watched, seemed to weigh down the cabin itself. That evening, as the sun began to set, the family gathered around the fireplace, hoping for some warmth and comfort. The light flickered and danced, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. It was peaceful, but somehow the quiet felt different now, too thick, as if the forest itself was leaning closer, listening. When night finally fell, the darkness outside was absolute, impenetrable. They could hear nothing but the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the old wooden cabin. But just as Ben was about to douse the flames for the night, they all heard it, the faintest sound from outside, like something scraping along the wall of the cabin. They froze, the sound piercing the silence like a whisper that only they could hear. Then it stopped, leaving them all to wonder if they'd imagined it. But deep down, each of them knew that something was out there, lurking, waiting, and they had no idea what it wanted, or how close it really was. No one in the Whitaker family slept well that night. Every sound outside, Every groan and creak from the old cabin felt like a threat. When Ben finally drifted off, it was only to slip into a troubled dream of dark forests, clawed hands, and hollow eyes watching him from the shadows. Morning arrived with a thin layer of mist clinging to the ground outside, swirling around the trees in ghostly tendrils. Lisa awoke first, her skin prickling with a strange residual fear. She tried to brush it off as just nerves. After all, it was only a cabin in the woods. They had a whole week here. She couldn't spend the entire time feeling like something was out to get them. But when she glanced out the window, her heart stopped. Footprints, long and narrow, dotted the ground just outside the cabin, right below the window. They were like nothing she'd ever seen. Long and deep, almost clawed, as if something heavy had padded around the perimeter of the cabin in the dead of night. Lisa didn't want to alarm the kids, so she carefully slipped on her jacket and headed outside, her breath clouding in the cold morning air. She knelt beside the tracks, feeling her heart pound harder with every second. The footprints were even stranger up close, unlike anything she'd seen, almost as if they were pressed into the ground by something unnatural. "Mom? What are you doing out here?" Lisa jumped, whirling to see Ella standing in the cabin's doorway, her face pale and worried. She'd seen the footprints, too. "Nothing, honey," Lisa said, though her voice didn't sound convincing, even to herself. Just taking a look around. Go back inside, it's chilly." Ella lingered, her eyes flicking from her mother to the forest beyond. "We need to leave, Mom. Something's wrong here." Lisa was about to reassure her daughter when they both heard it, a faint, distant whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. It was so soft, it was almost inaudible, but there was no mistaking the eerie sound. It came from somewhere deep in the forest, far enough that they couldn't make out words but close enough to chill them to the bone. "What was that?" Ella asked, her voice barely a whisper. Lisa's mind raced. She couldn't tell her daughter what she was feeling, couldn't let Ella know just how scared she was. So instead, she forced a smile and tried to brush it off. "Just the wind," she said, her voice far steadier than she felt. "Come on, let's go inside and have breakfast. It's probably nothing." Reluctantly, Ella followed her back inside. But the strange whispers stayed with her, twisting through her thoughts like a vine. Inside, Ben and Max were already awake, trying to keep the mood light by planning their next activity. Ben suggested they go down to the lake for a bit of fishing, to really enjoy the wilderness experience. Max was thrilled, but Ella and Lisa exchanged an uneasy glance. The idea of going deeper into the forest made both of them feel sick with dread. Despite their protests, Ben was insistent. "Look, guys, it's going to be fun. We came out here to get away, right? Let's not let a little spookiness ruin the whole trip." Lisa gave him a small nod, but she kept her voice low. "Ben, I think there's something out there. I found these tracks by the window, and it just feels wrong here." Ben looked at her, his expression softening. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Look, we're in the woods. It's normal to hear weird sounds and see strange tracks. It's probably just an animal." Lisa hesitated but finally nodded, trying to let his calm demeanor wash over her. But as they packed their gear and headed toward the lake, her gut wouldn't let go of the sense that they weren't alone. The lake was just a short walk from the cabin, down a narrow trail lined with wild undergrowth. The trees crowded close around them, casting strange shadows as the morning fog slowly lifted. Max led the way, eager and curious as always, while Ella hung back, sticking close to Lisa. The lake was beautiful, its still waters reflecting the dark trees and gray sky above. Ben began unpacking their fishing rods, and Max eagerly helped, while Lisa and Ella settled on a large rock nearby. The silence around the lake was complete, thick and stifling, like the forest itself was holding its breath. They'd barely been there for 10 minutes when a chill ran down Lisa's spine. She looked across the lake and saw movement among the trees, a dark, lanky figure, barely visible through the mist. "Ben," she whispered, clutching his arm. "Look." Ben followed her gaze, squinting. At first he saw nothing, but then it came into focus. A tall, shadowy figure, half hidden behind the trees, its form almost blending with the branches and leaves. It was watching them. Even from across the lake, Lisa could feel its hollow, hungry stare. Is that a person? Ben murmured, trying to make sense of the sight. Before Lisa could answer, the figure shifted, almost as if it had sensed their gaze. It stepped back, vanishing into the trees as silently as it had appeared. The forest swallowed it whole, leaving only the empty quiet. "What was that?" Ella whispered, clutching her mother's arm tightly. Her face was white, her eyes wide with fear. Ben forced a laugh, though it sounded shaky. Probably just another hiker, or maybe a hunter, but even he didn't seem to believe it. No hiker moved like that, so fluid and silent, almost as if it had been gliding rather than walking. They stayed by the lake a little longer, trying to ignore the lingering sense of dread, but none of them could fully relax. Even Max, usually full of energy, sat close to his parents, constantly glancing over his shoulder. The sense of being watched pressed down on them, heavy and unshakable. Finally, Lisa couldn't take it anymore. "I think we should go back to the cabin." Ben didn't argue this time. He packed up their gear, and they all started back up the narrow trail, their footsteps quickening as the shadows seemed to lengthen around them. As they approached the cabin, the wind picked up, carrying with it that same faint whisper they'd heard earlier. It was clearer this time, the sound almost human, like a voice just out of reach. It echoed through the trees, soft yet insistent, as if calling them back into the woods. Max clutched his mother's hand. "Mom? What's that voice saying?" Lisa's heart hammered in her chest. She didn't answer, but deep down she could have sworn she knew the answer. It was a warning, or maybe a threat, whispering to them from the depths of the forest. As they closed the door of the cabin behind them, locking it tight, Lisa finally allowed herself to breathe. But as night fell once more, she realized with chilling certainty that whatever was out there wouldn't give up so easily. They were being hunted, and it was only a matter of time before the shadows found their way inside. The Whitaker family spent the remainder of the day in a tense silence, each of them haunted by what they'd seen by the lake. The eerie figure lurking across the water, the strange whispers in the woods, all of it cast a shadow over any attempt at a normal vacation. As evening crept in, Ben tried to keep up a brave front, urging everyone to gather around the table for a card game. Max's usual enthusiasm was dampened, his eyes constantly darting to the windows, as though expecting to see something, or someone, peering in. Ella, normally quick to challenge her younger brother, sat quietly, her face drawn with worry. Ben did his best to keep their minds off the strangeness. "So, how about we have some s'mores tonight? We could start a fire outside, like real campers." But even Lisa, usually the voice of reason, shook her head. "I don't think it's a good idea. Let's stay inside tonight." Her voice was tight, and her eyes betrayed a lingering fear. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, just waiting for them to step outside. They played cards until darkness blanketed the woods around them, the silence pressing down on the cabin like a weight. By the time they were ready for bed, an unsettling quiet filled the room, broken only by the occasional crack of wood from the fireplace. As the hours passed, everyone eventually drifted off to sleep. The forest seemed to settle, the night growing still, until a soft, persistent tapping broke the silence. Tap, tap, tap. Lisa opened her eyes, her heart racing. For a moment she lay still, hoping the sound was a figment of her imagination. But then it came again, louder this time, tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the front door, like a knock. She sat up, holding her breath, straining to hear more. Beside her, Ben was still fast asleep, his breathing deep and even. Lisa was about to shake him awake when she heard another sound, a low scraping noise against the wood, like claws dragging slowly along the door. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like something desperate to get inside. Finally, Ben stirred, his eyes blinking open. "Lisa, what's wrong?" "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ben sat up, rubbing his eyes, and listened. The tapping had stopped, but in its place was a faint shuffling sound, like something brushing against the walls of the cabin. He swallowed hard, glancing at the kids' bedroom door to make sure they hadn't woken up. It's probably just an animal, he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Lisa shook her head. It's too deliberate. It's like it's trying to get Ian. Ben forced a weak smile. Come on. Let me check it out, okay? It's probably nothing. Against her better judgment, Lisa watched as Ben climbed out of bed, threw on a sweater, and grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand. He moved toward the front door, his footsteps light and cautious. The tapping resumed, as though sensing his approach, and this time it was accompanied by a low, rumbling growl, a sound so deep it vibrated through the floorboards. Ben hesitated, the flashlight shaking slightly in his hand. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and reached for the doorknob. Ben, don't, Lisa pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. But he shook his head. We can't hide in here all night. With a final glance back at her, he opened the door a crack and shone the flashlight into the dark. For a few heart-stopping seconds, there was nothing but empty air and the rustling of leaves. Then he caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the beam, something tall and gaunt, lurking just beyond the clearing. Hello? Ben called out, trying to keep his voice steady. Who's there? The creature froze, caught in the beam for only a moment, and Ben's blood ran cold. Its body was emaciated, with limbs that were impossibly long and twisted, its skin stretched tight over sharp bones. Hollow, black eyes stared back at him, gleaming with a terrible hunger, and a pair of antlers rose from its head, jagged and twisted like dead branches. Ben's breath caught in his throat as the creature's lips curled into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. It seemed to move without stepping, sliding closer with an unnatural grace. Suddenly, the creature lunged forward, its clawed hand reaching toward the door. Ben reacted instinctively, slamming the door shut and bolting the lock. He backed away, his heart hammering in his chest, barely able to comprehend what he'd just seen. Ben? Lisa's voice was panicked, her eyes wide as she rushed to his side. What did you see? He could barely speak, his voice choked with fear. I don't know. It was standing right there. It's real, Lisa. I don't know what it is, but it's real. Just then, a loud, deafening bang sounded against the door, rattling the frame and sending a shudder through the cabin. The children's bedroom door opened, and Max and Ella stumbled out, their faces pale with fear. Mom, Dad, what's happening? Max asked, his voice trembling. Lisa pulled them close, her own fear evident, but she tried to keep her voice calm. It's okay, honey. We're all here. We're going to be okay. The banging continued, relentless, as if the creature outside was testing the strength of the door. With each thud, the wood creaked and splintered, the thin barrier feeling more fragile by the second. Maybe it'll go away, Ella whispered, clutching her mother tightly. Ben shook his head, feeling the weight of dread settle over him. Whatever was outside, it wasn't going to leave. Not until it got what it wanted. Grab the fireplace poker, Ben said to Lisa, his voice steady but strained. And if anything happens, take the kids and run out the back. I'll try to hold it off. Lisa's face crumpled with fear, but she nodded, gripping the poker with trembling hands. She looked at the children, pulling them closer, praying that the nightmare would end. The banging stopped suddenly, leaving a chilling silence in its place. For a moment they all stood frozen, waiting for the next sound, the next move. But the silence stretched on, thick and heavy. Just as they began to relax, a faint scratching started again, this time from the back wall of the cabin. The creature was circling, testing every point of entry, seeking a way inside. It's not going to stop, Lisa whispered, her voice barely holding back tears. Ben, what do we DDO? He didn't answer, because he didn't know. All he could do was stand there, helpless, as the creature prowled outside, slowly closing in. Outside, in the pitch-black forest, the Wendigo's eyes gleamed with a terrible anticipation. It could feel the family's fear, taste it on the air. It knew that soon, it would find a way inside. And when it did, there would be no escape. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, and they knew they were out of time. The scratching at the walls grew relentless, a twisted symphony that filled every corner of the cabin. Each scrape and drag of claw against wood seemed to chip away at their resolve, fraying the last remnants of hope. Lisa held the children close, their small bodies trembling against her. She could feel Ella and Max breathing quickly, holding on to her as if she were the last bit of safety in their world. She looked to Ben, who stood near the door with a fireplace poker gripped in his hands, his face pale but determined. "We can't stay here," Ben whispered, barely loud enough for Lisa to hear. "It's testing every wall, every window. Sooner or later, it's going to find a way in." Lisa swallowed, a tight lump of fear in her throat. "What do we do? We can't just run into the woods. It's out there." Ben nodded slowly, his eyes darting to the small bag of supplies they'd brought for the trip. Flashlights, matches, a few energy bars. He grabbed the bag and threw it over his shoulder, then looked back at Lisa and the kids with a fierce determination. "I don't think we have a choice," he said, his voice low and urgent. "If we stay here, it's going to get us. But if we head down to the main road, maybe we can find a car passing by. Someone who can help." Lisa hesitated, torn between the cabin's false sense of safety and the terrifying unknown outside. But as another heavy thud struck the cabin wall, shaking the windows in their frames, she realized there was no choice left. "Okay," she whispered, barely able to believe she was agreeing to this. "Okay, let's go. We'll head to the road." Ben nodded, gathering the kids and pressing a flashlight into Ella's hand. "Hold on tight to each other. Don't let go, no matter what happens. We stay together, understood?" Ella and Max nodded, fear clear in their eyes, but they clung to their parents with a newfound determination. Ben moved to the back door, taking a deep breath. He looked to Lisa, and she gave a small nod. Together, they slipped out into the night, the air cold and still around them. The forest loomed dark and endless, trees twisting like shadows in the night. Lisa cast one last glance at the cabin, the only sanctuary they'd known. It now felt like a trap, a fragile shelter that could no longer protect them. The family crept down the path that led from the cabin to the main road. Every rustling leaf, every snapping twig sent their hearts racing, their eyes darting to the shadows that seemed to press in closer with each step. "Stay close," Ben whispered, his voice barely audible over the muffled crunch of their footsteps. They walked in tense silence, the only sound their labored breathing and the distant call of an owl. The forest seemed to be holding its breath, as if it too were aware of the predator lurking among its shadows. Just as they neared a break in the trees, a low growl echoed through the night, freezing them in place. Lisa turned, her flashlight trembling as she shone it into the darkness. For a moment she saw nothing, just endless, inky shadows. But then, at the edge of the beam, a glint of hollow black eyes met her gaze. The creature was there, no more than 20 feet away, its tall, emaciated form partially hidden behind a tree. Its skin hung tight over its bones, and its antlers stretched out like jagged, withered branches, casting twisted shadows across the forest floor. Its eyes, void of any humanity, were fixed on them, a chilling hunger gleaming in their depths. "Run!" Ben shouted, breaking the silence. The family bolted, stumbling through the undergrowth as branches clawed at them, and roots threatened to trip them with every step. Lisa clung to Max's hand, practically dragging him as they sprinted. Ella ran just behind them, her breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. They could hear the creature crashing through the forest behind them, its movements impossibly fast, despite its skeletal form. It didn't run like a human. Its body seemed to glide, closing the distance with each unnatural lunge. Ben led them through the trees, veering off the path in a desperate attempt to lose the creature in the dense underbrush. But the Wendigo was relentless, its movements almost taunting, as if it knew the family was trapped. Just as they began to lose hope, a small clearing appeared up ahead. In the center, they saw the faint glint of a rusted old hunting shack, barely more than a skeleton of wood and rusted tin, but a shelter nonetheless. "Head for the shack," Ben shouted, his voice choked with exhaustion. They sprinted toward it, crashing through the last barrier of trees before they stumbled into the clearing. Ben threw open the shack's door, ushering everyone inside. The shack smelled of damp wood and decay, But at that moment, it felt like a safe haven. They huddled inside, breathing heavily as they tried to steady their racing hearts. Ben pushed an old wooden crate against the door, hoping it would hold if the creature tried to break in. For a few moments, they sat in silence, listening. Outside, the forest had gone silent again, the eerie quiet amplifying every creak of the shack. Lisa clutched Max tightly, feeling his small body shake with terror. Ella's eyes were wide, fixed on the door as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. Then, a soft scratching began again, this time from the roof. It was slower, almost patient, as though the creature were savoring their fear. They could hear it moving across the roof, dragging its claws along the tin, the sound piercing through the shack's thin walls. Lisa's heart hammered in her chest, her body frozen with dread. She could hear Max whispering under his breath, a quiet, desperate plea for safety, but she had no words of comfort to offer. Ben looked around the shack, his eyes darting for anything they could use to defend themselves. He found an old hunting knife on a rickety shelf, its blade dull with rust but still sharp enough to cut. He gripped it tightly, his knuckles white with tension, and moved to stand between the family and the door. The scratching on the roof was relentless, each scrape echoing inside the shack, grinding against the family's nerves. With every step the creature took above them, the old tin roof groaned under its weight. It was as if the Wendigo was toying with them, savoring the fear that filled the shack like a tangible force. Lisa held Max close, trying to shield him from the terrifying reality just beyond the walls. Ella clung to her father, her wide eyes reflecting a mixture of horror and despair. Ben held the old hunting knife tightly, his knuckles white, as if it were the only thing standing between them and the creature outside. The creature's movement stopped, and a suffocating silence fell over them. For a moment, they dared to hope that it had finally given up, that maybe, by some miracle, it had decided to leave them alone. Then, from the far corner of the shack, came a low, guttural growl. Lisa felt her blood turn to ice as she turned, her flashlight trembling in her hand. She hadn't even realized the shack had a back window. It was small and broken, a narrow rectangle near the ground. And through that window, she could see it, the creature's hollow eyes gleaming in the darkness, fixed on them with a chilling intensity. "Ben," she whispered, barely able to keep the panic from her voice. It's at the window." Ben looked over, his face pale. He held the knife up defensively, as if that would somehow keep the creature at bay. But deep down, he knew they were trapped. The Wendigo's thin lips pulled back, revealing a jagged, unnatural smile, as if it knew the terror it was instilling in them. Slowly, it reached one long, clawed hand through the window, its fingers curling and uncurling as it tested the space. "Everyone stay back," Ben whispered, positioning himself between the creature and his family. He brandished the knife, though he knew it was almost useless against something like this. The Wendigo's arms stretched impossibly far, its claws raking against the wooden floor of the shack as it reached further inside. The sight was grotesque, its bones twisting and stretching in ways no human body could move. The family huddled back, their breaths shallow, their eyes fixed on the horror unfolding before them. Lisa's mind raced, desperately searching for something, anything, that could give them a chance. Then she remembered the box of matches in their bag, and her gaze fell on the pile of dry, brittle wood in the corner of the shack. "Ben," she whispered urgently, her voice barely audible. "We could set the shack on fire. It might be our only chance to escape." Ben's eyes widened, realization dawning on him. It was a risky idea. The fire could trap them inside if they didn't act fast. But looking at the creature inching closer, they knew they were out of options. He nodded, passing Ella the flashlight. "Hold this," he said, his voice low and determined. "When I give the signal, we're going to make a run for it. Stay close to each other, and don't look back." Lisa quickly struck a match, the small flame illuminating the dark shack. She hesitated for just a second, watching the tiny flame flicker, before touching it to the pile of wood. The dry timber caught instantly, flames licking up the sides of the shack as thick smoke began to curl upward. The Wendigo hissed, recoiling from the heat, its eyes narrowing in anger. Its hand jerked back, retreating from the flames, but it didn't move far. It lingered just outside the shack, its hollow eyes peering at them through the smoke. The flames spread quickly, the shack's old wood crackling as the fire consumed it. The heat grew intense, the air filling with acrid smoke, but the family stayed huddled together, waiting for the right moment to run. "Now!" Ben shouted, grabbing Max's hand and pulling him toward the door. Lisa took Ella's hand and together, they burst out of the shack into the cold night air. They sprinted into the forest, their only light the faint glow from the burning shack behind them. The creature's furious roar echoed through the trees, a sound so deep and raw it sent shivers down their spines. They didn't dare look back, didn't dare slow down. Branches slapped their faces and roots tripped their feet, but they kept running, the adrenaline and terror pushing them forward. The burning shack cast strange shadows across the forest, and they could see the Wendigo's silhouette, tall and monstrous, outlined against the flames as it began to pursue them once more. "Faster!" Ben yelled, his voice tight with desperation. They veered off the path, plunging into the densest part of the forest, hoping that the underbrush would slow the creature down. But the Wendigo moved effortlessly, its form gliding between the trees, closing the distance with horrifying speed. Lisa's lungs burned, her legs aching, but she kept going, her grip on Max's hand tightening. She could feel his small body trembling, his breaths coming in terrified gasps. Finally, they broke through a cluster of trees and saw it, the main road. Relief flooded through them, but there was no time to celebrate. The Wendigo was almost upon them, its claws stretching out, its breath hot and rancid on the back of Lisa's neck. A blinding light appeared ahead, a car speeding down the road, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Ben frantically waved his arms, screaming for help, and the car skidded to a halt just as the family burst onto the road. The driver, an older man with wide, startled eyes, rolled down his window. "What in the world? No time," Ben shouted. "Get in. Please, we have to go." The man barely had time to process their fear before he unlocked the doors, and the family scrambled inside, piling into the back seat. Ben slammed the door shut just as the Wendigo emerged from the edge of the forest, its black eyes narrowing at the sight of its prey slipping away. "Drive!" Lisa screamed, her voice trembling. "Please, just drive!" The man, too shocked to question, hit the gas. The car lurched forward, speeding down the dark road as the Wendigo gave a furious, bone-chilling scream that echoed through the night. Lisa looked back, her heart racing, and saw the creature standing at the edge of the forest, its antlers casting eerie shadows across the road. It watched them go, its eyes filled with a dark, seething rage. But it didn't follow. It simply stood there, fading into the darkness as the car sped away, leaving the burning shack and the horror of the forest behind. The family sat in silence, catching their breath, their bodies numb from exhaustion and fear. The driver glanced at them in the rearview mirror, his face pale and filled with questions, but he said nothing. He could see the terror etched on their faces, and somehow, he knew that whatever they had escaped was something he would never understand. As the lights of a small town appeared on the horizon, Lisa pulled her children close, pressing a shaky kiss to each of their foreheads. They had escaped the Wendigo's grasp, but its memory, the hollow eyes, the clawed hands, the whispers in the forest would haunt them forever. The drive to town was silent, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional soft sniffle from Ella. The family sat huddled together in the back seat, trying to process the ordeal they had just survived. Ben's arm was around Max, his grip tight, as though afraid his son would vanish if he let go. Lisa held Ella's hand, rubbing her thumb over her daughter's knuckles, trying to calm her own frayed nerves as much as the girls'. The older man who had picked them up stole frequent glances in the rearview mirror, concern etched into his weathered face. He seemed to want to ask questions but thought better of it, sensing that whatever the family had been through was too raw, too strange for words. Finally, they saw the dim lights of the small town flicker into view. The man pulled into the parking lot of the only open establishment, a lone diner, its fluorescent sign buzzing in the night. "You folks, you look like you could use a warm meal," the man said softly, breaking the silence for the first time. Ben nodded gratefully, though he could barely muster a smile. Thank you. For everything. You saved us. The man nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and confusion. You take care now, and don't go back to those woods. People around here, they know better than to wander too far from town. He gave them a final, searching look before pulling away, the taillights of his car fading into the distance and leaving them alone in the parking lot. Inside the diner, the bright lights and mundane chatter of a few late-night patrons felt surreal. The warmth of the room was almost overwhelming, and the family found themselves momentarily stunned, as if they'd stepped into another world. They were greeted by a waitress with a warm smile, though her eyes quickly filled with worry as she took in their disheveled appearance. Goodness, you all look like you've been through a storm, she said softly. Come, sit down, I'll get you. Some hot chocolate on the house. They settled into a booth near the window, their bodies still tense, unable to relax fully. Ben watched the entrance, his gaze fixed on the door as if expecting the creature to burst through at any moment. Lisa kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, and the children clung close to her, eyes darting around the diner, still on edge. The waitress returned, setting mugs of hot chocolate in front of them, and they sipped in silence, the warmth helping to ease some of the chill that clung to their bones. After a while, the sheriff walked in, his eyes sleepy but attentive, as though summoned by some instinct that told him trouble had rolled into town. He was a tall, sturdy man with a neatly trimmed mustache and a face lined with years of dealing with midnight emergencies. He approached their table, tipping his hat. Evening, folks. Got a call from George, the man who picked you up. He said you might have run into something. Out there? Ben and Lisa exchanged glances. What could they say? How could they explain what had happened in a way that didn't make them sound insane? We were out in the woods, staying at a cabin, Ben began, his voice shaky. Something came after us. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't human. It followed us, tried to get inside. The sheriff's face remained impassive, but a flicker of understanding passed through his eyes. He nodded, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. You folks aren't the first, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. People disappear in those woods every now and then. Local legend says there's something ancient out there, something that feeds on people's fear, their souls, if you believe the stories. Most folks around here know to steer clear of those parts. Lisa felt a chill run down her spine, the reality of their encounter settling heavily on her. This creature, this Wendigo, wasn't just some monster in the woods. It was part of the very fabric of this place, woven into the land and the air, as real and as deadly as any wild animal. Why? Why hasn't anyone done something? Lisa asked, her voice a mixture of anger and fear. Warned people or put up signs? The sheriff sighed, his expression weary. Some things you can't just stop. Some things have been around longer than any of us. People put up signs, tell their stories, but you can't keep everyone out, and those who don't believe. Well, they find out the hard way. He placed a gentle hand on Ben's shoulder. The important thing is, you're safe now. I'd suggest you get a motel for the night, rest up. But if I were you, I wouldn't go back to those woods, ever. Ben nodded solemnly, feeling the weight of the sheriff's words. We won't, he said quietly. Thank you. The sheriff gave them one last nod before heading out, leaving the family alone once more. They lingered in the diner for a while, each of them lost in their own thoughts, grappling with the reality of what they'd seen, what they'd survived. As they finished their drinks, Ben leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. We survived because we had each other, he said, looking at each member of his family. We're never going to forget this, but we're going to move forward, together. Lisa reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. Ella and Max joined in, their small hands warm, a reminder that they had made it through the nightmare as a family. The memories of the Wendigo would haunt them, but together they felt a flicker of strength returning, a glimmer of hope in the wake of darkness. They left the diner, the cold night air bracing against their skin, and checked into a nearby motel. As they settled into bed, Each of them took comfort in the warmth of each other's presence, the knowledge that they were safe. And as they drifted into a fitful sleep, they knew they would never again take for granted the simple, precious gift of family. In the depths of the forest, far from the quiet town and the flickering lights, the Wendigo lurked in the shadows, its hollow eyes watching, waiting. It knew there would be others who would come, others to feed its hunger. For the forest was its domain, its eternal hunting ground. And it would be waiting. The next morning, the family left the motel as soon as the sun rose. The air was cold and thick with the last whispers of night, and the sky was still painted with the pale colors of dawn. They were eager to leave the town and put as much distance as possible between themselves and those haunted woods. They packed their belongings in silence, the dread of the previous night still hanging over them like a dark cloud. Ben drove with his hands gripping the wheel tightly, his eyes focused on the road ahead, while Lisa kept glancing back, as if half expecting to see the creature's hollow eyes lurking somewhere in the shadows. It was only a few hours later, just as they were nearing the highway, that they noticed the gas gauge. The needle had dropped alarmingly fast. "We're almost out of gas," Ben said, frowning. "I don't understand. I filled the tank before we went to the cabin." Lisa's face paled and she whispered, "It's like it doesn't want us to leave." Ben didn't answer, but he pulled the car over at a small, nearly deserted gas station on the side of the road. The area was eerily quiet, and there was no attendant in sight. A thin layer of mist clung to the ground, curling around their legs as they stepped out of the car. They all stayed close, huddled together as Ben filled the tank as quickly as he could, casting nervous glances over his shoulder. As Ben finished, a strange, cold breeze swept through the station, and the mist seemed to thicken, swirling like a living thing. The air grew heavy, the silence oppressive. They felt as if something was watching them, something ancient and patient, lurking just out of sight. "Get in the car," Ben whispered, his voice tight with urgency. He ushered Lisa, Ella, and Max inside, his heart racing as he turned the ignition. But the car wouldn't start. Ben tried again and again, his hands trembling. He pounded the steering wheel, his mind racing with panic, and in the mirror, he saw Max's terrified face, his eyes wide. "Daddy," Max whispered, clutching his sister's hand. "It's here." Ben's gaze snapped forward, and his heart dropped. Emerging from the mist, just beyond the edge of the gas station, was the Wendigo. It stood motionless, its hollow eyes fixed on them, its skeletal form towering over the ground, framed by the swirling mist. There was a hunger in its gaze, a dark, insatiable need that sent a shiver down Ben's spine. He tried the ignition one last time, and, miraculously, the engine roared to life. "Hold on!" he shouted, slamming his foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, speeding down the road. Lisa clutched the kids tightly, whispering reassurances that none of them believed. They watched as the Wendigo disappeared into the mist behind them, and for a brief, precious moment, they dared to believe they were safe. But then, with a sickening crack, something struck the side of the car. Ben swerved, trying to keep control, but the car skidded off the road, hurtling down an embankment. They crashed through trees, the world a blur of motion and sound, until finally the car slammed to a stop against a fallen log. The impact knocked the breath out of them, leaving them dazed. Ben's head throbbed, and his vision blurred, but he forced himself to focus. His family, they needed him. Is everyone okay?" he rasped, looking around. Lisa moaned, clutching her arm, which was bleeding. Max and Ella seemed shaken, but otherwise unharmed, their eyes wide with fear. Relief flooded Ben, but it was short-lived. Through the shattered windshield he saw movement. The Wendigo was there, slowly descending the embankment, its black eyes fixed on them, its twisted smile stretching across its face. It was savoring the moment, relishing the fear that radiated from the car like a beacon. "No," Ben whispered, his voice filled with despair. He tried to unbuckle his seatbelt, but it was jammed, trapping him in place. He looked to Lisa, his voice breaking. "Take the kids, run." Lisa shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, Ben, I'm not leaving you." Go, he shouted, the urgency in his voice leaving no room for argument. I'll hold it off, just take them and go, please. Lisa hesitated, her heart torn, but she knew he was right. With shaking hands, she unbuckled the kids' seatbelts, pulling them from the car. Ella clung to her, sobbing, while Max looked back at his father, his face etched with horror. Daddy, Max whimpered, reaching out, but Lisa pulled him close, forcing him to turn away. Ben watched as his family stumbled up the embankment, disappearing into the trees. He took a deep breath, gripping the broken knife he still held from the shack, and turned to face the Wendigo. The creature stood just outside the car, its gaze fixed on him with a dark intensity. It tilted its head, almost as if it were curious, before it lunged forward, its clawed hand smashing through the window. Ben raised the knife, slashing at the creature's arm, but it was like striking stone. The Wendigo didn't flinch, didn't react. It simply smiled, its hollow eyes glowing with a predatory satisfaction. As its claws wrapped around Ben, he felt a cold unlike anything he'd ever known, a cold that seeped into his bones, draining him, filling him with a darkness that seemed to devour his very soul. His vision blurred, and the last thing he saw was the Wendigo's face, twisted into a grotesque smile as it drew him closer, consuming him. Lisa, Ella, and Max ran through the forest, their breaths ragged, their bodies numb with terror. They didn't look back, didn't dare to, as Ben's last scream echoed through the trees, filling the forest with a haunting, desperate sound that would linger in their memories forever. They finally stumbled onto the main road, their bodies exhausted, their hearts shattered. They collapsed onto the pavement, the realization sinking in that Ben was gone. He had saved them, sacrificing himself so they could escape, but the cost was almost too much to bear. As dawn broke over the horizon, casting a pale light over the forest, Lisa pulled her children close, whispering words of comfort she didn't truly feel. The forest behind them was silent once more, the Wendigo retreating into the shadows, satisfied. For now, they would return to their lives, but they would never truly leave that forest behind. They carried it with them, the memory of those hollow eyes and Ben's final scream, a shadow that would follow them always. For in those dark woods, something ancient and hungry still lingered, waiting for the next unwary soul to cross its path. And as the years passed, Lisa knew that no matter how far they ran, the Wendigo would remain, haunting the edges of their memories, a reminder of the night they barely escaped, and the man who hadn't.